they're happy to talk with the people who try to fight our battles for us, whether we necessarily want them to or not, but they don't want to talk to us directly. I think there's even probably some stigma there too of like, oh, we can't bring on someone with schizophrenia. I mean, they're just gonna ramble and rave, and they'll be stinky. They're gonna stink up the studio, and they could be dangerous. They might be a threat, and you don't know what kind of like batshit insane thing they're gonna say or do. They'll be having their hands in the air, and they'll freaking, I don't know, just start dancing. Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about schizophrenia and news media. I may make a separate video on media in terms of film and literature, but I think this topic is plenty for one video. I will first answer a few questions you may have on your mind at this moment. Number one, who am I? I am Nate. I am a person with schizophrenia, and I emphasize the word person there because there are quite a lot of people who either view people with schizophrenia as a fraction of a person or not even that much, just not a person whatsoever, much to my dismay. Second question, why am I recording this in my closet? Well, I live near a military base, so there are constantly planes flying overhead and very close down, so it makes a lot of noise. Also, I live with other people, and they, understandably can be a little noisy. And my neighbors also have a baby, and I don't know if the baby is asleep or not, but just in case, I don't want to wake the poor child up with my YouTube video. So the best place for me to be is just in my closet, which is way back in here, where I cannot bother anyone and no one can bother me. You may hear a little bit of noise throughout this though, just because the building itself is kind of noisy, especially on windy days. Third thing, I tend not to look at the camera. I try my best, but as I talk, I have a very difficult time maintaining eye contact with it as I'm trying to get my thoughts across. So just anticipate that I am not going to be looking at the camera very often. Okay, with all of that preamble out of the way, let's get into the main subject of this video. As an individual with schizophrenia, I have several problems with the news media environment, and one of the biggest ones is the way in which it sensationalizes the violence committed by people with schizophrenia. And I know the common stereotype is that we are like inherently violent or commit a lot of violent acts. That's not necessarily true, and there are actually some interesting statistics regarding that. So while it is the case that there's an estimated about 10% of people with schizophrenia who will engage in violent behavior, I believe it is 10 to 14 times more likely people with schizophrenia are to be the victims of violence rather than the perpetrators. Now, that isn't to be totally dismissive of the fact that people with schizophrenia, again, this is an estimate based on research that was done, we are 2 to 4 times more likely than the average person to commit a violent act, but again, we are also 10 to 14 times more likely to be the victims of violence. And I have seen other estimates in which it's a bit higher, like 15% of people with schizophrenia engaging in violent behavior. That said, that also includes other socioeconomic factors that would make the average person also more likely to engage in violence. So like being from a low-income household or growing up in an abusive household. Those are two things that can make someone more likely to commit a violent offense later in life. So that's not intrinsic, let's say, to people with schizophrenia. Exclusive, I think that's the word I was looking for. So with that said, the media has a way of hyperfixating on the small number of violent acts that do occur as a consequence of the actions of people with schizophrenia, whether they're actually in psychosis or not. Sometimes it still gets spun as if the illness was the result or was the cause of the violent behavior, and not, some other inciting incident. Or, sometimes some people are just bad, regardless of whether they have a mental illness or not. There's all sorts of things that can be the reason. And I think it's worth pointing out as well that people with schizophrenia, and also just in general people who experience psychosis, are a very small demographic. I mean, in the United States, I think it is, the numbers fluctuate because we don't always have the greatest data, and there's like holes in research. I've seen 1 million is the common number, but then I've seen some people say actually it's probably closer to 2 because it's underdiagnosed and underreported. So somewhere between 1 to 2 million people, which, I mean, is not to say that that is like a completely insignificant number of people, but I mean, compared to the fact that we have, what now, around 330 million people in this country, it's a pretty small fraction, and yet there is like this great worry of, and a lot of just fear-mongering, hate-mongering over the fact that people with schizophrenia are like very violent and deranged, and not only that, but it's like random violence, or it's like spawned by their illness. The illness just makes them violent, makes us violent. And again, you have to consider that, so somewhere between maybe 10 to 15% of people with schizophrenia will ever engage in violence, and that's ever, by the way, not even like recurring. I think there might be other studies on recurring violence. Another thing too is, because I know with the environment in the United States, obviously we have a lot of, like, unfortunately, like mass shootings. People with schizophrenia, I think it's about 1% of the total schizophrenic population will ever engage in a violent act involving firearms, or it may be actually that it's 1% of that 10 to 15%, which would be even less. Either way, quite a small number. I apologize for my brain being so foggy at times. I'm trying to recall all the different things I've read over the years, and also just recounting. Sometimes I'll recount my own experiences, but I try to speak in a more broader sense. Anyway, so the media tends to hyperfixate on this, which then leads to more negative stigma around people with schizophrenia. Also unfortunately leads to people with legislative power, politicians making laws based around the things that they see in media, and sometimes that's not even news media. Sometimes, to this day, things they see in film or on TV can impact their decisions or their understanding of this illness and what people who have it are like. And it's that on its own is baffling, but also the fact, I will say, very often, even politicians who are on, say, like behavioral health committees, you would be surprised how little they actually know about the things they are making decisions on. And that's not even exclusive to behavioral health. That honestly goes for a lot of things, and history has even demonstrated that as well. There have been plenty of points, not even just in this country's history, but in history in general, where we know after the fact that, like say this disease broke out, and politicians who were making these decisions on it had just no fucking clue what they were doing, and were just kind of winging it, and often are even in situations like that terrified themselves because they don't know what they're doing. But then I would also say that you should be more worried about the person who is confident they know what they're doing when they actually don't. That's just a recipe for disaster, but that's a caveat. So that's one side of the issue, and it also contributes to the problem of people, whether directly or indirectly, being hospitalized more against their will, which the World Health Organization is opposed to. given in at least in the context of schizophrenia, it's not an effective and productive way of treating the illness. It advises many other things, and you can find that on their website. And yet, it indirectly, I guess, can kind of, going back to what I was saying about politicians, it can sway their decisions on things. Like there's a bill going through Ohio right now. The Ohio House is House Bill 249. That would make it essentially easier to involuntarily commit people with certain mental health diagnoses. Not everyone with diagnoses, just certain ones. Schizophrenia being one of the 5. There was also like bipolar. I believe it specified schizoaffective. I'd have to look at that again. But basically, just about everything on the schizophrenia spectrum. Depression was on there as well. As a consequence of the media's actions, we see more hostility, we see a lot more ignorance and misconceptions, and we see more people getting deprived of their liberty, which can also later lead to them losing certain rights as well. Gun ownership is one such thing, the right to bear arms. Generally, if you are committed somewhere, after you are released, you will no longer have the ability to legally possess a firearm. Now, I think there may be certain nuances to that, but that's the general law. And so that's one example. And it certainly doesn't help either that mental hospitals can be quite hostile environments. They can be very traumatic for people, and they are rife with abuse. I believe this may have been globally. I think it might have been specific to the UK. There was a study that found that about 40% of female patients in mental hospitals are sexually assaulted. That's just one example. And I think it's worth saying too, because people often don't think about this. Doctors and just medical staff in general can have the same biases and be just as ignorant or thereabout as the average everyday person. The same goes for politicians, it goes for journalists, and this is a media-focused video, and I'll get on that subject as well. And so you have the media creating almost like mass hysteria in a way. And then we pay the price just because they want clicks, they want people reading, they want people watching. And it seemingly just is perfectly acceptable because we're already, a very much despised and misunderstood demographic. So, hey, if you're gonna have someone to sensationalize and target, then may as well pick us, because it's easy to kick us while we're already down and over again. So that's one whole side of it. And then, as I was saying a moment ago, you would think that this wouldn't be so common, but journalists, and I am someone who has written and had published some articles before, they can be also very ignorant about the things they are writing about, and they often go into it with their own biases and their own narratives. And the narratives play a big role because often people go into it with certain narratives and then they perpetuate those narratives, and that is like how we are very dangerous and we're a threat to society and one of the worst sorts of people there are. We're dirty, disgusting, violent, all these things. And then, but there's other ways in which this manifests as well. Sometimes it's the other way around, where it's like there's this desire to like infantilize us, like we can't speak for ourselves, we can't fight for ourselves, we can't have autonomy, we're perpetually miserable, we don't have any sort of existence outside of this illness, and therefore we need other people to like constantly hold our hand, and they need to speak for us, and they need to fight for us, and we're so pitiful and pathetic and helpless. And sometimes those two exist as contradictions in people's own beliefs. You'll see people who want to take away our rights or who want to just fearmonger about us. They will simultaneously act as if we are this great threat that needs to be dealt with in some way, or else it's going to be an utter catastrophe. And yet, it's so easy as to just like pass a law or two, put us in hospitals, and then just kind of lock us up, throw away the key. Like we're simultaneously this enormous threat, and we are all dangerous, and just you need to be worried about us and afraid, and yet we are so weak as to be just dealt with that simply. It's baffling, and it's fascinating too how a lot of people don't even notice that contradiction, or just simply don't care. It doesn't really matter. They just want us gone. Some people quite literally just want us gone from existence entirely, or other people, have the kind of like what I was describing, the out of sight, out of mind approach, where just, okay, we just lock them up for the rest of their lives. They won't be a problem for us normal people, and we don't have to worry about them anymore. So then that's a whole second side to everything. And then the third like main issue I have, and I think this will be the last one, unless my mind happens to conjure one up. I don't have a script or anything. I'm just going off the cuff, as they say. There is this tendency of news media, and I've experienced this myself in being someone who spoke out at a committee hearing against that aforementioned, I don't know why I pointed back there, there's nothing there, House Bill 249 in Ohio. The media will do its best to cut people with schizophrenia out of the story when it benefits them, and vice versa. They will hyper focus on us and put us at the center again when it suits them, and that's usually when they're telling a story of some terrible thing that was done by one of us. But then when they cut us out, would be like, again, fighting this legislation. I've seen many different articles, and even there's been some broadcasts where they have talked with all sorts of people, doctors, sheriffs, obviously the representatives who propose this bill, different people involved in like their communities, people from disability rights groups, and even some people who have experience being hospitalized, but who would not necessarily be impacted by this bill, at least at present, if it were to pass into law. And so, while that's all fine, I mean, I think there's merit in talking to all of those people. It is very bizarre and frankly just messed up to completely cut out the people who would be directly negatively impacted by this bill and act as if we don't exist. It's very odd. It's as if all these people are fighting over something that would apply to no one in reality, but it does. But if you were to just look at the articles and watch the broadcast and stuff, you could possibly just sort of lull yourself into like a mental sleep where you don't even stop and think about like, hey, wait a minute, what do the people this would actually apply to have to say about it? And I think part of that kind of goes back to those biases and those narratives I was talking about, where people either don't want to bring on someone with schizophrenia who is going to go against their narrative, and that might not even be a narrative tied to the bill itself, right? Like even if they're against the bill, they may have certain ideas, like that idea of people with schizophrenia are helpless, and they can't have any autonomy, and they are just incapable, incompetent, and they don't want to speak with someone or bring on or discuss somebody who goes against that idea, and which is very infuriating and unfortunate, just greatly dismaying. I've been quite mad about it, but more dismayed than anything. And I'm not saying like I am so important as to I should be interviewed by a news outlet, but it is interesting how in the case of this bill, I mentioned I spoke at one of the hearings. I was the only one who would be impacted by the bill to speak in person, and other people sent like written statements. I don't know how many of them, if any, would be directly impacted, but still, I think it stands that it's odd to me, though here's someone that would clearly be probably worth talking to, or at least bringing up some points that I had, because one of the people at the center of the issue. You know, this is my life and my liberty and rights on the line here, you know, and I may not be like a great speaker or some genius or a philosopher king of any sort, but I can speak pretty decently and I've got ideas. So it is quite frustrating in that regard. And I would, anyone, by the way, like it could be some other person with schizophrenia, it could be, yeah, maybe someone, there's gotta be people a lot more qualified than me to, you know, speak on like TV or have in an interview or something, or to just spread these ideas. It could be someone with one of the other conditions outlined in the bill that would be impacted by it. So either way, it's just extremely bizarre, and like I said, I think it's just genuinely messed up to be covering something like that that we are at the focal point of, and yet act as if we don't exist, or that we aren't able to fight for ourselves or speak for ourselves, you know. They're happy to talk with the people who try to fight our battles for us, whether we necessarily want them to or not, but they don't want to talk to us directly. I think there's even probably some stigma there too of like, oh, we can't bring on someone with schizophrenia. I mean, they're just gonna ramble and rave, and they'll be stinky. They're gonna stink up the studio, and they could be dangerous. They might be a threat, and you know, you don't know what kind of like batshit insane thing they're gonna say or do. They'll be having their hands in the air and they'll freaking, I don't know, just start dancing. That is really how some people kind of think. I'm being a little facetious, but that's not too far off from the reality of it. As for like as I'm doing these videos, I want to have solutions in them, ways we can move forward, because I don't think there's enough of that, for one, and two, I'm of the belief that we can't continue simply holding the line. I don't think that's a winning strategy, because just holding the line of preserving where we're at, the status quo, that line will get chipped away at, and we will gradually lose our rights and our liberty, and that's already in the process of happening in various states, and it has already happened in others, and it will continue to happen until we have nothing left and other people can just do whatever they want with us, just lock us up. We can't do anything, we can't have any freedom, and this illness is, I think we're going to take a step backwards in being able to successfully treat it and being able to allow people with schizophrenia to, or I should say empower people with schizophrenia to live better lives, whether that's because their illness has improved or just in spite of their illness. I have many ideas, but that are relevant for this video. I don't know what can actually be done, like what is within our own power, other than to just say, like, I don't know, if you're able to, and you have the interest and you have schizophrenia, maybe you should try journalism. Maybe we need more schizophrenic journalists. And I'm kind of half joking there, but I do think I'll have a video more on like opportunities for people with schizophrenia and the need, how we have to work together to create opportunities for our own community, demographic, whatever term you want to use, since we are often denied those by others, very often. We do need, if we are to advance, if we are to go on the attack, let's say, and not just preserve our rights, but to grow them, to advance them, we need to have people who are journalists, doctors, lawyers, people in positions that can be influential and where we are not constantly under other people's thumbs. But yeah, for the subject of news media, I don't know that I can really offer anything for it to improve. I think it's just a lot of it has to do with people's pre-existing notions and biases. So, I mean, I guess destigmatizing and continuing efforts in that regard and bringing proper awareness and knowledge about the illness and to kind of dispel all this ignorance is something that can be done. But I think the major issue is really just how the system works, and that in doing these things, they again generate clicks, likes, engagement, get people reading, get people watching, get people all worked up, get them outraged. If Fox News loves outrage bait, and so when there's such a strong incentive to do that, and they have such a small group of people they can do it to, that people already are predisposed to either just be outright hateful towards or fearful of, or just at the very least just be sort of negatively disposed to. It's easy for them to get away with that and then keep doing it over and over again, and there's no real incentive for them to stop, other than maybe they develop a conscience, but I don't think they will, because unfortunately this is a country and really a world that is fueled by money and greed. So there's not much I can really offer in terms of solutions for this video, but in other ones I have various things we can do going forward. Thank you for joining me in my closet. Maybe future videos I'll be able to escape from here, but for now this is going to be basically my recording studio. Well, thank you very much. This is going on way longer than I meant it to. I don't know how one would get enjoyment out of this, but I hope you enjoyed, and hopefully you made it this far. If you did make it to the end, how can I know that people did for sure? Maybe you should comment something. I'm a really big SpongeBob fan. If you work something involving bubble bass into your comment. I don't know how you will do that, how that in any way relates to news media, but just find some way to work that into a comment, and I will know you watched essentially to the end. Alright, thank you, and goodbye. Oh, you thought I was done. Well, you see, this was an unscripted video, and naturally I forgot to make one other point that I meant to include, and that is that when the media, in its quest to be impartial, it inevitably loops back around to partiality. I think I said that right. You know what, whatever. We're just gonna roll with it. What I mean is that there's this tendency to portray things as equal even when they aren't. A good example of this is like the climate change issue, in that the majority of Americans believe in climate change, and there is science backing that up, scientific evidence that there is indeed climate change, and yet still what is often the case is climate denialism, or just something in that territory, gets put at the same level as climate change, people believing in it, and that it is happening. It's very bizarre to me how we are equivocating these things, and that can happen in other ways too, where sometimes it can be a very small minority of people actually think something or are pushing a certain ideology or whatever, and yet we act as if they are like a greater force, or I say we, like the news media acts like it's a greater force than it really is. And I think part of that is kind of what I was talking about with the sensationalizing of things and needing people to click on their stuff and read their things however possible to get them ratings. And I think that's another element of all of this. And so I think it even probably ties oddly into the cutting out of schizophrenic people from the story, in that they will either go the way where they try to be impartial but they end up being partial, or they just straight up are like, we don't want anything that goes against our narrative or what have you, and therefore we're just gonna remove you from the equation as if you don't exist. Yeah, I guess it's a double-sided thing. That was just like a little point I wanted to bring up as well. And it does greatly disturb me how, one, that it's always a matter of, whoa, one half wants to preserve people's rights and the other wants to take them away, and they are at the same level, equally valid, equally true, or what have you, equally right. And the advancement of people's rights, or pushing forward that kind of idea I was talking about of not just holding the line, that is not even on the table the vast majority of the time in news media. And I think too, it's also just very disturbing that, like, oh yeah, like putting people in hospitals against their will for certain periods, and then them losing particular rights afterwards and while they're there, and potentially suffering abuse, which I've mentioned is very prominent in mental hospitals, and I'll probably make a whole separate video on that. Like, that is equal to the idea of not doing those things. And it's weird how even when evidence is on our side, and even when like the World Health Organization is against this, and we have, like, we've supposedly come such a long way, and yet we're still at this point where these sides are viewed, or at least portrayed, as roughly the same in merit. I guess it's different when you're on the outside, but when you're the person whose liberty and rights are being jeopardized, it's kind of a open and shut case for me. But I don't know. I'm supposed to be the crazy one, the irrational one, and yet it's funny how just absurd, contradictory, irrational, etc. the rest of the world can be. How callous the rest of the world can be, and that goes extra for the news media, since they actually influence how people think and act. It's deeply upsetting, but there are many more videos to come, so I'm not going to ramble any longer, because this one has gone on quite long enough. I also just ate a bunch of spicy food, so yeah, I think I'm done for today. Goodbye for real, and don't forget to put bubble baths in the comments if you made it this far, however you want to go about that. It would also be funny if you literally just said bubble bath. Farewell.